I watched my father's fortune being auctioned piece by piece, while my stepmother fought like a queen for her crown. She swore everything belonged to her, until I revealed the one lie that destroyed her. That day, the empire she built on greed came crashing down. The day my father died, the world felt quieter. Too quiet, as though even the air itself was holding its breath. He was not only my father, but a man of stature, wealth, and reputation. His name carried weight in every boardroom, and his fortune filled the halls of our family estate with art, antiques, and treasures from around the globe. To the world, he was a tycoon. To me, he was simply Dad. But where there is wealth, there is also greed. I still remember the moment the lawyer read the first part of his will. My stepmother, Lydia, sat across from me, dressed in black silk, her diamond earrings glittering, even in grief. She dabbed her eyes delicately with a handkerchief, but there was no tremor in her hands, no redness in her eyes. If anything, she looked expectant. I knew that look well. Lydia had always been a woman of appetite, not for food, but for status, power, and money. She had married my father late in his life, after my mother had already passed. At first, I tried to accept her, to give her the benefit of the doubt, but it didn't take long to see her for what she was, a woman who loved the empire more than the man who built it. The will was complicated, tied up with assets that couldn't simply be divided. There were properties, investments, and priceless heirlooms that couldn't be assigned with a signature. The solution, the lawyer explained, was an estate auction, where items of value would be sold to settle disputes and distribute wealth fairly. Fairly, Lydia repeated, her painted lips curving into the faintest smile. She didn't even try to hide her satisfaction. From that moment, I knew what she wanted, everything. The days that followed were a blur of preparations. The grand hall of our family estate was transformed into a stage for the auction, marble floors polished, chandeliers glittering, velvet ropes guiding the wealthy bidders who would come. Catalogs were printed, each item photographed and described in careful detail. I wandered through the hall the night before the event, my footsteps echoing as I passed display cases of jewelry, paintings, sculptures. Each piece held memories, my father's laughter, his stories, the way his eyes lit up when he spoke of history and legacy. To the bidders, these were commodities. To me, they were fragments of him. And then there was Lydia. She oversaw the arrangements like a queen preparing for coronation. She glided between staff and lawyers, giving orders, rehearsing her charm. She wore grief like a costume, but her eyes glittered with something far less noble. "You'll see, darling," she said to me one evening, her tone syrupy sweet. "Your father wanted me to have all of this. I was his wife, his confidant, his everything. I didn't answer. I just watched her, memorizing every word, every gesture. Because while Lydia believed the auction would crown her the victor, I knew something she didn't. Her empire was built on a lie. And soon, in front of everyone, I would reveal it. Do you think wealth unites families or destroys them? The morning of the first legal meeting felt less like a family gathering and more like a battlefield. Lawyers shuffled papers, assistants carried briefcases, and Lydia swept into the room like a monarch entering her court. Her black veil was gone now, grief no longer necessary for her performance. Instead, she wore a pearl-white suit, pristine and commanding, as though she already owned the empire she was about to fight for. I sat quietly at the end of the long mahogany table, my hands folded in my lap. The lawyer began outlining the distribution of assets, his voice steady, unemotional. Lydia, however, leaned forward, every word from his mouth feeding her anticipation. "Given the nature of the estate, certain assets will need to be auctioned," he explained. "This will allow for both parties to have equal opportunity in claiming items of personal or financial significance." "Equal opportunity?" Lydia repeated, her tone light but sharp enough to cut glass. "Forgive me, but as his wife, shouldn't I be granted priority? After all, I was his closest companion." Her words hung in the air like smoke. I met her gaze, and for a brief second, her smile faltered. She knew I saw through her performance. "Mrs. Davenport," the lawyer replied, professional but firm, "the court requires transparency. The auction is the fairest course of action." "Fairness," she scoffed softly, sitting back in her chair. "Yes, of course." But her eyes told another story. In the days that followed, Lydia's campaign began in earnest. She paraded around the estate, speaking to staff, neighbors, even journalists who caught wind of the auction. She painted herself as the grieving widow who had given her life to my father, who deserved every jewel, every portrait, every stone of the mansion. She took care of him in his final years, one of the staff whispered to me, repeating Lydia's carefully crafted narrative. "It only seems right she should have the estate." I didn't argue. I let her words circulate, let her play her part. But deep down, anger churned like hot coals in my chest. She hadn't taken care of him. She had managed him, controlled him, drained him of energy while surrounding herself with luxury. My father had been too blinded by charm, too weary to resist. One evening, I found her in the study, standing before my father's portrait. She was sipping wine, her figure framed by the firelight. "You must understand, darling," she said without turning. "This is mine. All of it. Your father intended it that way. He wanted me to live in comfort, to continue his legacy." I stepped into the room, my voice steady. "Did he? Or do you just want everyone to believe that?" She turned then, her smile wickedly calm. "Believe what you like. But when the gavel falls, the world will see that this empire belongs to me." I didn't answer. Instead, I met her gaze, letting silence say what words could not, because I already had what she feared most, proof. If you were in my shoes, would you trust her? Even a little? The day the catalogs arrived, the estate no longer felt like home. Each priceless object had been photographed and listed with a sterile description beneath it, reducing memories to monetary value. Lot 17, a French gilt clock, 18th century. Lot 24, a collection of emerald-studded brooches. Lot 41, oil portrait of Reginald Davenport, painted 1989. That portrait, my father's image immortalized in paint, was listed like a trinket, destined for a stranger's wall. My chest tightened as I flipped through the glossy pages, every entry slicing a little deeper. The auction house staff arrived in waves, carrying clipboards and gloves, speaking in clipped professional tones. Soon, velvet ropes lined the hallways, glass cases displayed jewels, and paintings were hung with little numbered plaques. What once had been a home now resembled a museum preparing for its donors. I wandered the halls, memories colliding with the sterile arrangements. The emerald brooches, my mother's once, not Lydia's. I remembered her wearing them at garden parties, her laughter ringing like chimes. Now they sat cold in a glass case, their story erased. "This one will fetch a fortune," I overheard one appraiser say, pointing to my father's pocket watch. "Collectors will fight over it." The words made me want to scream. That watch wasn't just an antique. It had ticked in rhythm with my childhood, the sound I heard when I sat on my father's lap as he told me stories. And then there was the centerpiece, Lot 50, a jeweled key, crafted in gold with sapphires embedded in its bow. My father had always called it the key to legacy. It wasn't just decorative. It opened a chest in his study, a chest that contained documents, letters, and keepsakes of our family history. I stopped dead when I saw it in the catalog. Why was it even being auctioned? That key wasn't just property. It was the very symbol of our family's name. That evening, as I stood before the display case holding the key, Lydia appeared at my side, her perfume cloying, her smile smug. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she said, tilting her head. "Your father gave it to me once, you know. He said I was the only one who truly understood legacy." I clenched my fists. "That key never belonged to you. It was meant for the family." She gave a low laugh. "And who do you think family is, darling?" I was his wife, his chosen one. "Don't fool yourself, you were always secondary." Her words were poison, but I swallowed the anger. I couldn't afford to lose control. Not now, because I knew something Lydia didn't. The key wasn't just a trinket. Hidden in that chest were papers my father had never revealed to her, papers that held the truth about her so-called marriage, and when the time was right, I would use them. For now, I let her bask in her imagined victory, because the higher she climbed on her throne of lies, the harder she would fall. "What's the one item you'd never let go of if it was part of your family legacy?" The grand hall glowed with golden chandeliers on the morning of the first auction. Rows of polished chairs filled the room, occupied by collectors, aristocrats, and investors with sharp eyes and deeper pockets. The murmur of voices buzzed like bees, excitement hanging in the air. At the front stood the auctioneer, a tall man with silver hair and a voice trained to command attention. The gavel rested in his hand like a weapon, ready to strike. And then there was Lydia. She arrived draped in emerald silk, a necklace of pearls cascading down her chest, diamonds glittering at her wrists. She looked less like a grieving widow, and more like royalty presiding over her coronation. As she swept past the rows of bidders, whispers followed her. She smiled, lifting her chin, basking in the spectacle. I stayed in the back row, deliberately silent, my presence unnoticed by most. But my eyes never left Lydia. The auction began with small items: silverware, crystal sets, antique vases. The gavel fell again and again, bids soaring higher as the crowd's appetite sharpened. Lydia bid on nearly everything, raising her paddle with careless arrogance. She didn't care about the items themselves. She wanted to show dominance, to make it clear that the estate was hers, even if she had to buy it piece by piece. Lot 12, a set of sapphire cufflinks, once belonging to Reginald Davenport. The auctioneer's voice carried through the hall. Lydia immediately raised her paddle. 5,000. 6, called a man in the front row. 10. Lydia snapped without hesitation. The room chuckled softly at her ferocity. Item after item, she fought like a hawk, outbidding collectors who came prepared for a battle of wealth. And she won, at least in her mind. Every victory added to her illusion of power. But to me, every win was another rope tightening around her neck. By the time Lot 24, the emerald brooches, was unveiled, Lydia's eyes glittered feverishly. "These belong to me already," she announced loudly, interrupting the auctioneer. "They were gifts from my husband." I felt the room shift. A murmur ran through the bidders, some raising eyebrows at her brazenness. The auctioneer cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable. "Madam, everything listed today is property of the estate," he reminded her firmly. "Gifts or otherwise, the court has ruled for auction." Lydia's smile flickered, but she quickly recovered, raising her paddle higher. "Then I'll buy them back." At any price, her voice carried, sharp and unyielding. And in that moment, I knew her greed was no longer subtle. She wasn't just here to claim, she was here to conquer, to humiliate, to erase me from the legacy. But I also saw something else, a flicker of fear in her eyes when the gavel struck, as though she worried her empire wasn't as secure as she pretended. I stayed silent, my plan carefully tucked away. Let her play the queen. Let her show her greed to the world, because the more she revealed, the sweeter her fall would be. Would you fight publicly for what's yours, or wait quietly for the right moment? The auction stretched over several days, each one peeling back another layer of the empire my father built. Collectors came and went, some leaving triumphant, others frustrated, but no one could ignore the woman who dominated every session, Lydia. By now, her greed was impossible to disguise. She wasn't buying with strategy or sentiment, she was buying with obsession. Every paddle raise was an act of defiance, a declaration that this empire belongs to me. On the third day, a rare 17th century globe was rolled onto the stage. My father had kept it in his study, running his fingers over the faded maps as he told me stories of voyages and trade routes. To me, it was a relic of wonder. To Lydia, it was simply another jewel to add to her crown. Lot 32, antique globe, mahogany stand, 1660s, the auctioneer announced. 10,000, Lydia's voice cut across the room before anyone else could breathe. A man in the second row hesitated, then raised his paddle. 15, 30, Lydia countered instantly, her eyes flashing. The room buzzed with disbelief. The globe wasn't worth a fraction of that price, and yet Lydia's determination burned brighter than reason. The gavel struck. The globe was hers. But instead of pride, her smile looked brittle, stretched too thin, as though she feared losing her grip. It was the same with every item. A rare violin, a marble bust, a collection of antique coins. Lydia claimed them all, even when others dared to bid. She waved her paddle with such ferocity that bidders began stepping back, some muttering that it wasn't worth the trouble to compete. By the fourth day, her antics had turned into a spectacle. Journalists scribbled notes, Photographers snapped pictures of the widow Davenport raising her paddle again and again. To the outside world, it was scandalous, entertaining. To me, it was evidence. The more Lydia revealed her greed in public, the easier it would be to turn the crowd against her. That evening, as the hall emptied, I found her standing by a gilded mirror, admiring a necklace she had just won. The diamonds sparkled under the chandelier, but her reflection revealed something else. Her eyes darting nervously, her fingers trembling ever so slightly. "You're awfully quiet, darling," she said, her tone dripping with mockery. "Jealous, perhaps? You've watched me claim everything your father left behind, and yet you do nothing. Why is that?" I held her gaze, steady and calm. "Because I don't need to fight for what isn't truly yours." Her lips curved into a sharp smile. "Oh, but it is mine. It always has been. He loved me, not you. That's why he chose me to inherit his world." I wanted to laugh, but I didn't. Instead, I leaned closer, my voice low. "You've mistaken possession for love, and greed for victory. That's why you'll lose for a moment." Her smile faltered, just for a moment. Then she straightened her necklace and swept past me, her heels clicking against the marble floor. She thought she was winning, but every empire of lies eventually eats itself alive. Do you think greedy people always reveal themselves in the end? By the 6th day of the auctions, the estate no longer felt like mine. The house that once echoed with my father's voice was now filled with strangers, their chatter a constant reminder that everything was being stripped away piece by piece. Yet beneath the sound of gavels and Lydia's triumphant bids, I carried a calm resolve. Because my father had left me more than possessions, he had left me his legacy. Late that night, when the bidders and lawyers had gone, I slipped into his study. The room smelled faintly of old books and cigar smoke, as though he were still there. His leather chair sat pushed back from the desk, his globe in the corner, now gone, thanks to Lydia's greed. But what mattered most was the chest in the far corner, hidden beneath a velvet cloth. The jeweled key, lot 50 in the catalog, was meant to unlock it. For years I had watched my father open that chest with reverence, placing letters, photographs, and documents inside. He never told Lydia about it, not once, and I knew why. Because within that chest was the truth. I traced my fingers along the lid, wishing the key were still mine. Lydia had paraded it into the display case, unaware of what it could reveal. She thought it was just a glittering trinket, another symbol of her power. She had no idea it was the very thing that could destroy her. I remembered the night my father told me the story. "If there comes a time when my legacy is questioned," he had said, his hand resting on mine, "you'll find the answers in here. Not everything that glitters is gold, my dear. Some people hide their lies behind it." At the time, I didn't fully understand. But now, with Lydia clawing at every scrap of his empire, I finally saw what he meant. The documents in that chest were more than family history. They were proof. Proof of Lydia's deceit. Proof that she had never been legally entitled to call herself his wife. And if I revealed them at the right moment, the empire she so desperately fought for would collapse around her. The next morning, as I walked through the auction hall, I watched her laughing with a group of wealthy bidders. She leaned against the velvet rope, diamonds glittering at her ears, her voice syrupy and sweet. She looked untouchable, powerful, untouchably victorious. But all I saw was a woman building her throne out of stolen bricks. I took a breath, steadying myself. Timing was everything. If I revealed the truth too soon, she'd twist it, manipulate it, bury it in her theatrics. But if I waited until the final auction, when the room was full, when her victory seemed certain, that was when the blow would be devastating. So I smiled quietly, letting her revel in her illusions. Because while Lydia believed she was writing the final chapter of my father's story, I was preparing to rewrite it. And this time, the ending would be mine. What matters more? Money or truth? Rumors have a way of spreading like cracks in glass. Quiet at first, almost invisible, until the entire surface shatters. By the 7th day of the auction, the whispers had begun. Lydia, once admired for her poise and elegance, was now the subject of raised eyebrows and hushed conversations. Her relentless bidding, her sharp tongue, her arrogance, it was beginning to wear thin. "She doesn't even look at the catalog before she bids," one man muttered behind me as Lydia raised her paddle yet again. "She acts as though it's all hers already," another whispered. "Greedy thing." The comments reached her ears, I could tell. Though Lydia laughed louder than usual, her eyes flickered, darting to the crowd as though searching for signs of rebellion. She could sense the tide shifting, but she didn't know why, and that was because I had nudged it. Quietly, carefully, I spoke to the right people during intermissions, those who loved a scandal, those who adored gossip. I didn't tell them the whole truth, not yet. Instead, I dropped breadcrumbs. "She wasn't even with him in his last months," I said softly to a bidder in the hallway. "The staff will tell you it was all appearances." To another, I murmured, "Funny, isn't it? How quickly she pushes for the auction. Almost as if she fears what the estate might reveal. I never said enough to accuse, only enough to sow doubt. And doubt, once planted, grows like wildfire." By evening, I overheard one of the auction house staff whispering, "They say her marriage papers might not be in order." I almost smiled. The seed had taken root. That night, I sat in my room, the chest heavy in my thoughts. I didn't yet have the jeweled key, but I didn't need it. I already knew what it contained. Proof my father never legally married Lydia. Proof she forged signatures, doctored documents, spun illusions to secure her place. I pulled out my father's old letters from my desk drawer, letters he had written to me in his careful, looping hand. In one, he had admitted his doubts about Lydia, his regret at being blind to her ambitions. He never had the heart to leave her, but he never gave her what she craved most, legitimacy. The letters alone would raise questions, but the chest would end the debate. And at the final auction, in front of bidders, journalists, and society's finest, I would open it. The thought filled me with both dread and determination. Lydia would fight back, of course. She would scream, deny, twist the truth as she always did. But with the documents in my hand, the mask she wore would finally shatter. The next morning, as the auctioneer announced the final lots, Lydia walked into the hall in a gown of crimson silk, bold and defiant. She looked untouchable, the queen of her kingdom, but the whispers followed her like shadows. clinging to her every step. She didn't know it yet, but her empire of lies was already beginning to crumble. Would you risk everything to reveal someone's darkest lie? The grand hall was overflowing on the day of the final auction. Every seat was filled, the air thick with anticipation. Collectors, investors, journalists, and even curious socialites pressed in, eager to witness the climax of what had become more spectacle than sale. The whispers about Lydia had spread beyond these walls, rumors of forgery, of greed, of secrets too scandalous to ignore. And yet Lydia strutted into the hall as though nothing could touch her. Draped in crimson velvet with diamonds blazing at her throat, she looked more like a queen ascending her throne than a widow defending her late husband's estate. Her heels clicked against the marble floor as she took her seat in the front row, her lips curved in a smile that dared anyone to oppose her. The auctioneer cleared his throat, visibly tense. He knew the room had shifted, though he kept his professional mask intact. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "we arrive now at the final lots of the Davenport estate." A hush fell. Paintings were paraded first, then the antique silverware, and finally the smaller heirlooms. Lydia bid furiously, desperate to prove she still reigned over the empire. Her paddle shot up at every item, her voice slicing through the hall. 50, 100, 200. Her greed was no longer impressive. It was grotesque. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some shaking their heads, others whispering behind gloved hands. I could feel the momentum tilting, the tide pulling against her. And then the auctioneer's assistant brought out the velvet box. "Lot 50, the auctioneer declared. A jeweled key, gold with sapphire inlay, believed to hold symbolic significance within the Davenport estate. The box opened, and the key gleamed beneath the lights, dazzling and dangerous. My pulse quickened. This was it. Lydia leaned forward, her smile triumphant. 500,000, she called before anyone else could breathe. Gasps erupted. It was an absurd bid, outrageous even for her. The auctioneer hesitated. "Madam, perhaps we should begin at—" "I said 500,000, she snapped, her voice sharp as a blade. "This key belongs to me." Her declaration echoed through the room, dripping with arrogance, and for a moment she looked victorious, her jeweled hand clutching the illusion of power. That was when I rose from my seat. The crowd turned, eyes locking on me as I stepped forward, my heart hammering but my voice steady. "That key doesn't belong to you, Lydia," I said, each word carrying across the hall, and it never did. Gasps filled the room. Lydia froze, her smile cracking as though it had been painted on too thinly. "What nonsense is this?" she hissed, rising to her feet. I walked down the aisle, each step deliberate, carrying a folder of documents I'd guarded for weeks. Because this isn't just a key to a chest. It's the key to the truth. And that truth is, you were never his wife. Not legally. Not in any way that matters. The hall erupted into chaos. Cameras flashed. Journalists leaned forward. Lydia's face drained of color as I laid the papers on the auctioneer's podium. Her empire of lies was seconds away from collapse. Should betrayal always be exposed publicly or privately? The room fell into a stunned silence. The kind of silence that hums with tension, every ear straining to hear the next word. All eyes flicked between me and Lydia, their queen suddenly stripped of her crown. "You're lying," Lydia spat, her voice trembling beneath its fury. "You're jealous, bitter, always were. My husband left everything to me." I lifted the folder higher, calm where she was unraveling. "Really? Then perhaps you'll have no issue if I share these documents with the entire room." The auctioneer, pale but curious, accepted the folder. He adjusted his glasses, flipping through the crisp papers inside. His brows furrowed, then his eyes widened. He looked up at Lydia as though seeing her for the first time. "These are annulment records," he said carefully, "filed in the courts nearly 15 years ago." The hall erupted, gasps, murmurs, whispers that grew into a thunder of disbelief. I stepped closer, my voice steady but laced with steel. "My father never legally married you, Lydia. Every signature you flaunted, every paper you waved, it was forged. You weren't his wife. You were his shadow." Lydia's face twisted, her composure fracturing. "Lies. All lies. He loved me. He promised me." "Perhaps," I interrupted softly, "but love is not law, and law is what this auction runs on." The journalists pounced, pens scribbling, cameras flashing like lightning. One called out, "Madam, do you deny forging the marriage certificates?" Another shouted, "Were you aware your claims to the estate were invalid?" Lydia's mouth opened and closed, but no words came. Her silence was louder than any confession. I turned back to the crowd, my father's letters in hand. My father trusted too easily. He admitted as much to me in these letters, but he left behind his true will, hidden in the chest this key unlocks. That will names me as his heir. Not Lydia, not a pretender. The auctioneer's assistant brought the chest forward, setting it beside the podium. The jeweled key glimmered in the light, and with a hand that did not tremble, I unlocked it. The lid creaked open, and inside lay the neatly bound will, sealed with my father's signet. I held it aloft for all to see. "Here," I said, my voice rising above the crowd, "is the truth my father wanted preserved. And today, before you all, his truth will finally speak." The hall roared, half in shock, half in vindication. Lydia stumbled backward, her crimson gown swallowing her as though it too recoiled from her lies. Her empire wasn't crumbling anymore, it was already rubble. I felt a strange calm wash over me. For the first time since my father's death, I wasn't powerless. I wasn't in her shadow. I was standing in the light of truth, and it was blinding. Lydia's eyes found mine, burning with hatred, but beneath it all, I saw fear. Real, raw fear. And in that moment, I knew I had finally won. If you were in that auction room, what would you have done when the truth came out? The hall was chaos. Reporters shouting, bidders storming out, lawyers frantically whispering into their phones. But at the center of it all, Lydia stood frozen, her face drained of the glamour she had worked so hard to polish. The queen had been dethroned in front of her court, her empire of lies reduced to ashes. The auctioneer, shaken but resolute, cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to the new evidence presented, the auction is hereby suspended until legal clarification is made." Effective immediately, gasps and groans filled the room. Some complained about wasted time, others hurried forward, desperate for a closer look at the documents I'd unveiled. But no one looked at Lydia with admiration anymore. They looked at her the way one looks at a scandal made flesh. Escort her out, the auctioneer instructed quietly to security. Lydia's head snapped up. Don't you dare touch me, she screamed, her voice cracking. She turned on me, venom dripping from her words. You think you've won? You think this changes anything? I made him love me, I made him mine. Her words echoed, desperate and hollow. I met her eyes, calm, almost pitying. You made him tolerate you. But love? Love doesn't need forged papers and stolen signatures. Love is honest, and you've never known honesty. She lunged forward as though to strike me, but security caught her arms. Cameras flashed wildly, capturing her wild fury. She shrieked and fought as they dragged her from the hall, her crimson gown trailing behind her like a fallen banner. The moment she was gone, a hush settled. I stood taller, my father's will still in my hands. This estate, I said, my voice steady though my heart hammered in my chest, will not be built on greed or lies. My father's legacy deserves better, and I intend to honor it. The journalists swarmed me after, their questions flying, but I answered only what I chose. This wasn't about spectacle anymore. It was about closure. That night, alone in my father's study, I read his will properly for the first time. His words were simple, but they carried the weight of love. To my daughter, who carries my true name and my true heart, I leave everything. May you protect what I could not. Tears blurred the page, but they were not tears of grief. They were of release, of finally stepping out of the shadow Lydia had cast for years. In the weeks that followed, the courts confirmed everything. Lydia's forgeries were exposed, her false claims dismantled piece by piece. She tried to fight, of course. Her lawyers argued, appealed, scrambled. But the truth was too solid, too undeniable. And me? I walked into my father's home not as a guest, not as an interloper in Lydia's charade, but as the rightful heir. The chandeliers sparkled overhead. The portraits of my ancestors seemed to watch in approval, and for the first time, the house felt alive again. The empire of lies had fallen, and in its place, I was ready to build something true. Do you believe karma always catches up with liars? They say greed builds empires, but lies always destroy them. My stepmother believed she could steal my father's legacy with forged papers and arrogance. For a while, she almost convinced the world, but the truth has a way of breaking through, no matter how deeply it's buried. That day at the auction, I didn't just reclaim my inheritance. I reclaimed my father's name, his honor, and my place in his story. Her empire of lies collapsed in front of everyone, and I walked away not with vengeance, but with peace. Because the greatest inheritance he left me wasn't wealth or jewels or land. It was the strength to stand tall, even when shadows tried to claim me.